All right, this week we're going to talk about, I think, an interesting question that has hashkafic ramifications. I know, John, you always like to raise questions on the Haredi hashkafa, so you may be interested in this one. The larger question of how much are you supposed to be afraid of things that are outside the strict purview of what we would consider Torah versus being willing to study things or encounter things that are potentially blasphemous or could lead people astray for the right reasons. In other words, everyone would agree that you shouldn't do it for the wrong reasons, but is there any idea of learning these things for the sake of being able to combat against them or for the sake of being able to know what they are really about so that you can be better informed about how not to fall prey to those things? And so just the larger question is where should we lie on that spectrum of kind of closing ourselves off to things that are outside of what we would consider classically Torah versus being allowed to study those things or even potentially being required to study those things in order to be able to, let's say, combat them. So before we even start the sugya, the probably one thing that's worth noting is just this famous Mishnah Pirkei Avot, right, where Rabbi Elazar Omer, Heve shakud l'lmod Torah, so you should be diligent in the study of Torah, v'da ma tashiv apikoros, and you should know how to respond to a heretic or to an apostate. V'da lifnei mi ata amel, know who before who you are laboring, in other words, God. V'neman hu ba'al malachtecha sheyishlem lecha schar pulatecha, and know that you will get reward from the Master, which is God, for the work that you're doing. Ba'olam hazeh, you will get a reward for that. But the idea is v'da ma shtashil apikoros, and we know there's tons of midrashim of stories and mishnayot even in Avodah Zarah itself, where you have minim or apikoros that come and challenge the rabbis with various psukim or ideas, and the rabbis then go and respond to them. And so the idea is, how are you supposed to be able to do that unless you know something about their ideology, their philosophy, or you have to be versed in the enemy, as it were, in order to be able to combat it. And so that seems to be what Rabbi Elazar is saying here. And so how do we know that that's permissible, or how permissible is that, and what situations is that allowed? And so we're going to be discussing this halacha that's known as lo tilmad la'asot, aval ata lamed la'avinu lehorot. That you're not allowed to do as the goyim do, but you're allowed to learn. You're not allowed to learn in order to do what they do, but you're allowed to learn in order to understand and to teach yourselves and others how to not do what they do. And we'll see shortly where that comes from, and basically we'll learn a few different sugyas and agadata that talk about that idea and show when it can be applied. Great. Just before we actually start, the Rambam in Perish HaMishnah on that Mishnah Pirkei Avot, we'll read that quickly, and then we'll go to our Gemara Avodah Zarah. So the Rambam says as follows. So Amar, he says that Rabbi Elazar meant as follows: Tzarich shetilmad dvarim shetashiv behem lapikorsim min avdei kochavim v'tachlok alehem v'teshivim. Right, you should be well equipped to argue with them and to respond to their challenges. Im yikshu lecha, right, if they question you. V'amru, and the rabbi said, Afal pi shetilmad deot ha'omot ladat ech tashiv alehem. But the rabbi said, even though you should learn the philosophies and the faiths of the nations in order to know how to respond to them, hishamer shelo ya'aleh libcha belibcha davar min hadeot hahem. You have to be very careful when you learn those things, not to let one of those things actually ya'aleh belibcha, that you should actually start to believe it. Right, v'da shemi shetavod lefanav yodeh tzafun libcha. Right, because you should know that the one who you are worshiping, in other words, God, knows what is hidden in your heart. If you start to be led astray and start to believe these heretical philosophies, know that God knows that that's what you're really thinking and believing. And that's why the Rambam claims, right after saying V'da mashtashil apikoros, Rabbi Elazar continues and says V'da lifnei mi ata amel. Right, on the one hand, you need to work hard to know how to respond to the heretic, but always keep in mind who you're actually doing that work for. You're doing it for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and so you should do it in a way where you don't get led astray. How you're actually supposed to do that is a good question. But so that's the Rambam Perish HaMishnah. Okay, so now let's learn a few sugyot which talk about this idea of As I said, lo tilmad la'asot, aval talamed la'avinu le'orot. So we'll start in our sugya in Yaakov in Avodah Zarah Daf Yudchet Amud Aleph, which tells the story of the execution of Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon. So we'll just read the story as follows. At you, Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon. The Romans came to Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon. Amru le amayk asakta be'oraita. Why are you studying Torah? Amar lehu kasher tzivani Hashem Elokai. And Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon says, because God told me I have to. Miyad gazru alav l'sreifa v'al ishto l'hariga v'al bito l'shev b'kupa shel zonot. So immediately the Romans declared he would be burned to death, his wife would be killed, and his daughter would be sentenced to life in a brothel. So the Gemara asks, why such the harsh punishments? I love this sreifa. Why was he sentenced to burning? Shaya hogeh et Hashem be'otiotav. That he would say the name with the letters, or he would pronounce the name with the letters. So different Mefarshim understand that to mean different things. Rashi says that means the 42-letter name, which is not supposed to be pronounced. The other Mefarshim say it means Yud Ke Vav Ke, that he actually said the way it's actually spelled. But he was actually saying the name in a way, the Shem Meforash, and something in a way that's not permitted. So the Gemara asks, Vehechi Avid Hachi. How could he do such a thing? That's none. Don't we have a Mishnah in Perek Chelek in Sanhedrin? Elu she'en lahem chelek l'olam haba. Right? There's a whole group of people who don't get olam haba. Ha'omer ein Torah min hashamayim, ve'en tchiyat ha'metim min ha'Torah. Ve'abba Shaul omer, af ha'ogeh Hashem be'otiotav. So how could Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon have even thought to do this if we know that this is one of the things that if somebody does it, he has no place in olam haba? So the Gemara answers, Li talmid avad. He did it in order to teach. Kedetanya, it says in the pasuk in Dvarim Yudchet, Lo tilmad la'asot. The pasuk there is, you should not learn to do like all of the goyim around you. And the Gemara says, Aval talamed la'avinu le'orot. So it means that you're not allowed to learn these things in order to do them, but you're allowed to learn them in order to understand them and to teach them to others. In other words, to learn what not to do. So since saying the Shem Meforash is the Chilul Hashem, there is a heter, apparently, to actually go and do it if your intention is in order to A, understand it, and B, to then teach it to the right people in the right circumstances to make sure that the Chilul Hashem does not happen. Right? You can't have an idea where if it's forbidden to say the Shem Meforash, so people need to know what's forbidden. So you need to be able to know what is the thing that's forbidden. So it has to be passed down in some sense. That's what Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon was doing, and the Gemara claims that is permitted. And that's not the category that Abba Shaul is saying is people who don't have olam haba. So the Gemara says, okay, if so, elamai tamei anish. So if he did it in a permitted way, so why was he sentenced to death, to burning? The Gemara isn't why did the Romans sentence him. The Gemara is why was he punished in a divine sense for doing something that was permitted. And the Gemara says, Mishum hoget Hashem b'farhesya, because even though you have this heter of avalata lamed lehavinu leharot, but Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon did this in public. He taught he said the Shema Meforash in front of people in public, and that's not permitted. And so even though it's not technically an avera, it doesn't fall under the category of Abba Shaul, of people who don't have place in olam haba, because he did it for the right reasons, but he still, because he did it before Hesya, Hashem still punished him with sreifa, because as we'll see in Gemaras going forward, Hashem is mitdakdek with his tzaddikim kechut hasara, that when it comes to the tzaddikim, Hashem punishes them even for very minor things that aren't really an avera, but just are not the proper way to do something. So anyways, Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon was sentenced to burning. And again, what's going to occupy us is this idea of lo tilmad la'asot aval lamed la'avinu le'orot. We see here that one example of this heter is when it comes to saying the Shem Meforash. Let's just finish the story in our Gemara. Ve'al ishto l'hariga. Why was his wife sentenced to death? Shelo delo michabe, and she didn't protest that he was doing this in public. Mikan amru kol mi sheyesh biyado limchot ve'eno mochen enash alav. Anyone who has the opportunity to protest somebody who's doing something wrong and does not do so is punished as though they had done it themselves. The classic example of this that probably comes to mind is Aaron at Mei Merivah. That Moshe did something wrong and Aaron stood by silently, so the classic interpretation is that he was punished for not protesting.
All right, can I ask a stupid question? Considering what you just said about how it looked like he was doing it in a permitted fashion, how was his wife supposed to know that what he was doing was wrong?
Because what he was doing is teaching it in public, and he shouldn't have taught it in public. That's what the Gemara says.
It seems like everybody else didn't realize that either, though.
What do you mean?
Because in the story, we said that the reason why he was... So it said, right, right? So that's the part that everybody was... That's the standard, right?
Yeah.
The standard was teaching it that it's okay. So the question was, well, why was he punished? But doesn't that imply that nobody understood why he was punished? And therefore the Gemara had to bring a reason for it, which was the publicity, like the public aspect of that teaching. So why would she know if nobody else realized? No other Talmidei Chachamim knew.
I understand. You're saying, how should his wife have known something that only the Shakli V'Tara of the Gemara eventually figured out?
Yeah, it seems like they learned that out later. Like they think
right. They weren't sure. They had Avamina, and then they eventually concluded that. But now they're assuming that his wife knew the conclusion of the Shakli V'Tara, and they're blaming her for not knowing it. Yeah. I don't know. I hadn't thought of that when I learned Gemara. It's not a stupid question at all. It's a very sharp question, I think. I guess the assumption is that in the Shakli V'Tara, it's almost going... Right, sometimes the Gemara goes through this line of logic, not because it actually... More just to draw out the point and to elucidate the point. Not that... Meaning that really everybody knew that he was doing it in public and that was a problem, and his wife should have known that. But the Havamin in the Gemara isn't that they didn't know and then they came up with the reason, but rather that they're just going through that logic in order to really emphasize the point. But I hear what you're saying. Yeah. I think maybe a better answer that I can give to your question is, even though it's not necessarily consistent with the context of this little Gemara, but this Gemara is actually part of a larger story that I didn't bring here. Which talks about how there's a Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma, who approached Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon and said to him, stop teaching Torah in public because you're going to get yourself killed. Because the Romans forbade it, and Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma says something to the effect of, God now is in a place, there's divine anger in the world, the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, now's not a time to go teaching Torah in public, you shouldn't be too righteous, right? Take it easy. Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon comes and he says, Mina Shemayim Yirachamu. No, he says, I'm going to do it anyway. So that's also an interesting question where there's kind of times of Shmad, like, are you supposed to go despite that and go teach, or when are you supposed to kind of let the evil time pass and then come back? So perhaps the idea is that she should have protested, maybe not in the sense of teaching the Shem Hashem with the letters, or saying the Shem HaMeforash, but in the larger sense of the way Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma tried to protest when he spoke to Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon, in the sense of now's not a time to be doing this bichlal. Like if the Romans are coming and saying, you're teaching Torah, we're going to sentence you to death, his wife should have said to him, have some sense, man. That's just how my way of potentially interpreting it now, because you raised the question. But within the context of this particular... just looking at this Gemara, that doesn't seem to be what it's saying. It's saying that Shelo Micha, and that she didn't protest. Delo Micha would seem to be going on what was said immediately before, which is that he was saying the Shem HaMeforash, and not on the larger point that he was teaching Torah in public, which is what Yosef ben Kisma a few lines earlier what did actually protest against. But maybe you can understand it that way, and then she should have protested, because maybe he would have listened to his wife, right? She should have said, you shouldn't be teaching Torah in public bichlal, forget the Shem HaMeforash. It doesn't specify what she should have protested against. Good question. Okay, good. Val bito leshev b'kupa shel zonot, and then his daughter was sentenced to sit in a brothel. I like this one. This is a good one. This is a very frum one here. Rabbi Yochanan said one time Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon's daughter was walking in the same place as the nobles of Rome, and they said, wow, look at how nice the steps of that maiden are. In other words, look at how she's walking. And then she took extra care to walk in a more noticeable way. So again, there's no clear avera here, but she's obviously doing something that's not proper, so she gets punished in an exponential way, and is sentenced to living in a brothel because she was a tzadekas. והיינו דאמר רבי שמעון בן לקיש, מה דכתיב, עוון עקבה יסובני, עוונות שאדם דש בעקביו בעולם הזה, מסובין לו ליום הדין. A drasha about how your steps in this world can lead you to have punishment in the world to come. And then the Gemara concludes, בשעה שיצאו שלשתן, and when the three of them went out to be executed, or to have their punishments given to them, צדקו עליהם הדין. All three of them did צדקו הדין. Acknowledging the divine justice in their punishments, even though their punishments were so extreme. Hu Amar, Rabbi Hanina said, Hatzur Tamim Po'alo. The rock, his ways are righteous and complete. Vishto Amra, and his wife said, Elam Munav en Avel, or he's a God of faith with no crookedness. Bito Amra, a pasuk from Miyahu, Gadol Etzav Rav Aliyah, Asher Einech Pekuchot Al Kol Derachai V'Gomer, same idea. Basically, all three of them did tziduk adin. Amar Rebbe, Kama Gdolim Tzadikim Halalu, Shenizdamnu Lahen Shalosh Mikorot Shel Tziduk Adin, B'Shat Tziduk Adin. And when they're being punished for their punishments, and the Gemara then continues to talk about Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon, right? He was wrapped up in a Sefer Torah with the sponges. We're all familiar with the story. It comes right after this. That in that moment, he had the ability to say, Atzur Tamim Po'alo, how great was such a tzaddik, how great was his wife, how great was his daughter. So this is the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. Right, so we'll just Rashi and Tosfos here just pick up on an interesting point. Rashi says, what does it mean, li talmid avad? That Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon he taught Shema Meforash in order to teach it. So Rashi says, Umiyu HaKadosh Baruch Hu medakdek im hatzadikim kechut hasara. So Rashi says, like we said, God is very, very exacting in justice, even to a hair's breadth with his tzadikim, like a very extreme punishment. That even though, so Rashi says, even though you have this heter of lamed la'avinu lehorot, and even though there's that drasha that it's permitted to do it when you're going to do it to teach, even so, a tzaddik like Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon shouldn't have done it, because he should have been careful for the kavod of Hashem. That's what Rashi says. Tosfot says, it doesn't make sense. Perish akuntrus umiyo kadosh baruch hu medakdek v'chulei. Rashi gives an explanation. Tosfot says, v'nira shelo ya katuv b'sifro ela mai taima iyanish hogeh b'farhes yahaya lekach hu tzrach latet tam acher. Tosfot says, why does Rashi need to give an explanation for why the Talmud Avad explains why Rabbi Hanina Ben Teryadon was punished? Because the Gemara says right afterwards why I was punished, right? It says right afterwards, "My time anish mishum hoget Hashem b'farasya." He did it in public, so it's true you have this heter, but that heter doesn't grant you the license to go do these things in public. That's what the Gemara says. But Rashi seems to try to explain why just the heter itself was a reason for him to be punished. In other words, that he shouldn't have followed the heter. So Tosfos says Rashi must not have had that next line in the Gemara of why was he punished, because he taught in public. If that line is missing in Rashi's Gersa, so the Shakla V'Tarya for Rabbi Hanina ends with the heter of Lamed Le'avinu Le'orot. So Rashi then goes and says he shouldn't have done it even with the heter. And Tosfot says that's the only reason to understand Rashi's comment. So it's just an interesting kind of attempt by Tosfot to explain why Rashi is giving another explanation for why Rabbi Hanina was punished, in addition to the one given explicitly by the Gemara. Okay. Let's learn now a few other Gemaras, a few other use cases where this heter of learning something forbidden in order to understand it and to teach it applies. So there's Gemara in Sanhedrin on Daf Samach Zayin Amud Aleph. The Gemara says as follows. It says, there's a Mishnah. The Mishnah says, HaMediach Zeh Omer Nelech V'Na'avod Avodat Kochavim. It's talking about various categories of people that need to be stoned for leading people astray. So the Mishnah says you have a category of someone named a Mediach, like someone who subverts. So that's someone who says, let's go do some idol worship on the side. Yeah, why not? Okay, and then the Mishnah says, a Mechashef, a sorcerer. So the Mishnah says, Ha'osem ma'aseh chayav v'lo ha'ochezet ha'inayim. So someone who does an actual act of sorcery, real magic, is chayav mita. When the Torah says the kishuf, someone who is mechashef has to be killed, that's only someone who does real sorcery. V'lo ha'ochezet ha'inayim, not someone who does an illusion, or someone who puts on a show. In other words, someone who, like a magician who's pretending to do sorcery, so that person is not chayav mita. Only someone who does real sorcery. Rabbi Kiva Omer, Mishum Rabbi Yoshua, Shnayim loktin kishuin, echad loket patur, v'echad loket chayav. 2 people can gather in cucumbers with sorcery, where they kind of say a spell and the cucumbers from the field all get gathered in. 2 people can do that. One can be pater mita, and one can be chayav mita. So he just kind of confirms or reiterates what the Mishnah just said, that if the person who does that actually used sorcery to do it, he's chayav mita. But if he does some kind of illusion to make it appear as though he had used sorcery, then he's pater. So that's the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, Daf Samach Zayin Amud Aleph. The Gemara on Daf Samach Chet Amud Aleph tells a story related to this Mishnah. The Gemara asks, V'hal Rabbi Akiva mi Rabbi Yeshua gemer la? Did Rabbi Akiva learn this idea about gathering in cucumbers with sorcery from Rabbi Yeshua, as the Mishnah says? V'ha Tanya, don't we have a Braita which says he learned it from Rabbi Eliezer? And now the Gemara tells the story. K'shechala Rabbi Eliezer nichnesu Rabbi Akiva v'chaverav levakro. So this story is much longer. I didn't quote the whole thing here, but there's a story. Rabbi Eliezer is on his deathbed, and Rabbi Akiva and some of the other students go to visit him. So they have a whole back and forth, and then as part of Rabbi Eliezer's discussion, he says the following. He kind of is lamenting, because at this stage in his life, you remember the famous story of Tanur Achnai. Rabbi Eliezer is in Nidui now. He was put in Cherem because of the whole story with the bat kol, and he refused to give up. So he's in Cherem at the end of his life. So he's lamenting to all the rabbis about various things, and he says, so he says, not only that, the things that I've been saying, but I also taught 300 halachot about a specific type of tzara'as, and nobody ever asked me about them. And then he continues, and then Rabbi Eliezer then continues and says, and furthermore, I also taught 300, or even another version says 3,000 halachot, having to do with this use case of planting, or here it's planting cucumbers using sorcery. 300 to 3,000 halachot. Nobody ever asked me about them, except for Rabbi Akiva. And then Rabbi Eliezer says, one time, me and Rabbi Akiva were walking on the road. Amar li Rabbi limdani b'nitiyat kishuin. So Rabbi Akiva said to me, Rabbi Eliezer, teach me how to use sorcery to plant cucumbers. Amarti davar echad, I said some spell. Nitmal'a kol sedek kishuin. They're walking in a field. Suddenly, the field is filled with cucumbers. So Rabbi Eliezer knew how to do sorcery to fill the field with cucumbers. Amar li Rabbi limadetani nitiyatan limdani akiratan. Rabbi Akiva says to him, great, thank you, Rabbi, you taught me how to plant them, now teach me how to uproot them and gather them together. Amarti davar echad nitkabtzu kulam lemakom echad. So then said another spell, and all the cucumbers were uprooted and they were gathered to one place. So Rabbi Eliezer taught Rabbi Akiva about how to gather cucumbers with sorcery. So, and then the story continues, Rabbi Eliezer says all sorts of other things, and then eventually he dies. He's on his deathbed, so the Gemara says, his soul left in purity. Amad Rabbi Yeshua raglav ve'amar hutara neder. So instantly Rabbi Yeshua gets up and says, the nidu is off, right? He's dead, so that's it. The neder has been nullified. L'motzei Shabbat pagabo Rabbi Akiva min Kesari lelod. So on Motzei Shabbos, Rabbi Akiva saw the funeral procession taking Rabbi Eliezer's body from Caesarea to Lod. Rabbi Akiva was striking his flesh so hard that he was causing his blood. The blood was dripping down onto the floor. That's how worked up Rabbi Akiva was about Rabbi Eliezer's death. And then he says a eulogy. When Elisha sees Eliyahu go up in a whirlwind of fire to heaven, Elisha says, Avi rechev Yisrael parashav. My father, right, as a sign of respect to Eliyahu who has just departed. So Rabbi Akiva quotes that pasuk in reference to Rabbi Eliezer, and then he continues and says, Harbe ma'ot yeshli ve'en li shulchani lahartzotan. Rabbi Akiva says, I have a lot of coins, but I don't have a money changer to accept them. Which is a metaphor for Rabbi Akiva saying, I have a lot of halachic shailas, but I don't have someone who can take the shailas and answer them for me, because now Rabbi Eliezer has departed from this world. So all of that was a story for the Gemara to ask the question on the Mishnah of Alma mi Rabbi Eliezer Gemara. Apparently, Rabbi Akiva learned how to learned the idea of uprooting cucumbers with sorcery from Rabbi Eliezer, as Rabbi Eliezer testified on his deathbed. So why does the Mishnah say that Rabbi Eliezer said in the name of Rabbi Yeshua that when it comes to uprooting cucumbers with sorcery, etc., etc.? He learned it from Rabbi Eliezer. So the Gemara answers, Gemara mi Rabbi Eliezer velo svara. He learned how to. In other words, he learned how to do it from Rabbi Eliezer, but he didn't understand it. Rabbi Eliezer said the spell, and Rabbi Akiva saw him do it, but Rabbi Akiva didn't actually understand how to do it himself. Right? Hadar Gemara mi Rabbi Yeshua v'asvara niale. But then later, he went and learned under Rabbi Yeshua not just how to say it, but how to actually do it himself. He understood how to actually do it himself. So the teaching is actually attributed to Rabbi Yeshua and not to Rabbi Eliezer. So that's what the Gemara says. And then it asks, Aval hechi avid hachi? Right, what's the obvious question? Right, you just told me in the Mishnah that anybody who uses sorcery to uproot cucumbers or to plant cucumbers is chayav misa. And here we have a story of Rabbi Eliezer actually doing that exact thing. So what are you talking about, right? You have to die. So how is Rabbi Eliezer telling a story of how he taught Rabbi Akiva how to do this if it's sorcery and it's forbidden by the Torah, and someone who does it is sentenced to death? The Gemara answers, Li talmed shani. It's different when you're doing it to teach. The Amar Mar lo tilmad la'asot talamed aval talamed lahavinu leorot. You're allowed to do sorcery if it's not for the purposes of Avodah Zarah, but for the purposes of understanding it and teaching it to people so that they themselves can know what not to do. And that is actually permitted, and that's what Rabbi Eliezer is doing in this story. Rabbi Akiva said to him, teach me how to do this, not so that I can, and then Rabbi Eliezer taught him, not so that he could do Avodah Zarah, but so that he should know how the Avodah Zarah works, and that's mutter. So we have here another example, in addition to saying Shem Meforash, here's an example of kishuf, of sorcery, of something that is aser, and it's even chayv misar. It's not just a lav or some small avera. It's a chumra it's a doraita that is sentenced to death, but as long as you have the intention of just learning how to do it, but not for the purposes of actually doing Avodah Zarah, but just to know how to do it so that you don't gets led astray, then it's actually permitted. Another example, Rosh Hashanah Daf Kavdal Amar Aleph. The Mishnah says, "Dmut sorot levana hayu l'Rabbi Gamliel b'tavla u'b'koto b'liyato, shebehen ma'eret ha'adyotot ve'omer ha'chazer ito chazeh." Right, the end of Rosh Hashanah talks all about Kiddush HaChodesh, all the halachot of declaring Rosh Chodesh. So it says Rabbi Gamliel was the Nasi, so he had pictures of different phases of the moon on the walls of his attic. Right, maybe like the gibbous or the full moon or the half moon, and he would point when people would come to testify and say they saw the moon or whatever it was. He would go point to the images of the moon on his wall and say to them, "Did you see like this or like that?" So the Gemara asked, Rosh Hashanah Daf Chav Dal Amud Bet, Vasiya Gredata Mishari, who says that he's allowed to do that? Vatanya, we have a brayta that says Lo Tasuniti. Right, it says you can't make images of Avodah Zarah. So lo tasun ki dmut shamashai hameshamshin lefanai kegon chamar levana kochavim mazalot. We have an explicit brayta that says it's forbidden to make images of the sun, the moon, and the stars. So how could Rabbi Gamliel have inscribed on his wall images of the moon? Even though he's doing it for the sake of Kiddush HaChodesh, but he's still violating an Isser D'Oraita of Avodah Zarah, isn't he? So the Gemara says, Shani Rabbi Gamliel de'acher masulo. No, it's different because he had non-Jews actually make the drawings for him. He didn't go and do the drawing. He had non-Jews do it, and then he put it in his house. And then the Gemara offers other potential solutions. It says, Rabim Shani. Maybe it's different because it was in... That Isser only applies if you do it privately, but here it was in public. The Gemara says, what do you mean? Rabbi Gamliel Yachidhu. Rabbi Gamliel is an individual. It's considered like it's the Rabbim because he was the Nasi and it was put in a place that a lot of people were constantly visiting. The Gemara gives another possibility. Maybe it wasn't one holistic image, but he made it out of a lot of different sections that were put together, and then that doesn't violate the halachic technical isser of doing it, an image of Avodah Zarah. The Yibayit Ema, or if you want, you can say Lihi Talmed Avad. He did it in order to teach. Uchtiv lo tilmad la'asot, aval talamed la'avinu leorot. the purpose that Rabbi Gamliel did when he inscribed these images was to teach the Hedyotot how to make sure that they were doing Kiddush HaChodesh correctly. And so here we see even Avodah Zarah itself, right? The worst of the worst. Even Avodah Zarah, if it's done lehavinu leorot, is actually mutter and not aser. Not just kishuf and not just saying the Shema Meforash of Chil Hashem. I know we're short on time. It's actually already been half an hour. So maybe we'll skip. There's another example in Shabbat on Daf Ayin Hey Amud Bet. But I'll just kind of conclude here with something the Meiri says, where it says in Sanhedrin, a group of people, actually we saw before, who don't have Olam Haba. And Rabbi Kiva Omer, Afa Koreh B'Sfarim HaChitzoniyim. Rabbi Kiva says in that list, people who learn secular books have no place in Olam Haba. That's something that's forbidden. So that should obviously trouble us. But the way Meiri interprets that, this isn't in the Gemara, this is the Meiri already. He says, Rotzeh lomar shelo le'avinu le'orot, ela al dat le'lech b'munatan. That when Rabbi Akiva said somebody who learns secular books has no place in Olam Haba, that was only said if he is doing it in order to do what those books say and to follow their faiths. But if he does it, lehavinu le'orot, if his intent is to understand it and to teach it so that you can be equipped to, let's say, respond to an apikores, then it is actually permitted. So the Meiri takes this idea of lo tilmad lasot aval talamed lavinu le'orot and applies it to the case of learning secular studies or secular books, which is not in the Gemara itself, but the Meiri takes that extrapolation. So just to conclude, obviously, right, the large idea, there's this fascinating heter of very, very serious and significant averot, that if you are doing it with the intention makes all the difference. If you're doing it in order to teach against it, you can actually do the avera itself. And we saw a few examples of that, and even skipped a couple of examples. And perhaps that can be applied, as the Meiri tries to do here, to the potential prohibition of learning secular studies or secular works that could potentially be blasphemous or problematic, that if you're doing it for the right purposes, which is to understand it and then to learn it, and how to combat those things, then it may be permitted. It's the last thing I'll say is what is clear to me from this is that this does not mean, as the Meiri does not seem to be saying, that there is inherent value in and of itself to learn these things just for their own sake. In other words, like part of the ashkafa of Datilu, Miman, and Orthodoxy is that there's value to learn like science and mathematics, even if they have absolutely no Torah application, because there is value to them even in their own right. So at least in this context, that doesn't seem to be the point. The idea is more that if an atheistic scientist comes and gives you all sorts of arguments, that you can be equipped to combat them and still maintain your faith. That is at least one way where the Meiri is taking this idea that comes up in several sugyas and applying it to something that is obviously very important and relevant to our lives from a hashkafic perspective. Adkan. Shkoyach. Shkoyach.